Adam Sipthorpe is the global sourcing lead for techno carbon removals at South Pole. He leads the techno carbon removals practice with South Pole's sourcing team and originates and develops business relations globally with project owners, finance providers, and technology providers. Thank you, Andrew. Adam, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to the whole Wall Street Green Summit team for putting this together and allowing me to present today. So like Rob said, I'm a sourcing manager for South Pole, specifically on the origination of technical carbon removal projects. And what we do actually is we work with the companies implementing these projects to help them to register certified carbon projects and allow them to have certified carbon credits to sell. We also have a very large amount of potential buyers to sell these credits to. And of course, one technical carbon removal technology type is called BECCS, and that's what I'll be speaking about today. We don't have long, this is a big topic, but what I'll cover is I'll just introduce quickly what BECCS is, and then I'll go into a little bit of detail on the source of the biomass and why really this is causing two distinct branches to come out of BECCS, one called BECCS and then the other that's using a new name called BICers. Then I'll also touch upon the storage elements of it. But then I'll also explain why there's a little bit of controversy sometimes around this and how we can mitigate this, and then around the long-term potential, around the volumes and what everyone's interested in, the pricing. I'll flesh it out with a couple of different examples and then explain how we need to move further in this market. So to begin with, of course, okay, what is BECCS? So BECCS combines bioenergy technology with carbon capture and storage to enable the net removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere into the geosphere. So it's a negative emissions technology, or a CDR, carbon dioxide removal. And although, of course, it isn't the only negative emissions technology, it is unique in the fact that it also can produce an energy source that can be used and harnessed in the form of either electricity and heat, or as a gaseous or a liquid fuel as well. So in a nutshell, I guess how it works is carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere via photosynthesis, and this is stored in plants in the living matter. And then at the end of the production line, the biomass is then burned, normally for electricity. And if the CO2 is released, then of course this can be best case scenario, it can be net neutral. But if you capture the CO2 and then store it permanently, then it can be net negative. And in fact, as more carbon is removed from the atmosphere, then is released back into the atmosphere. So therefore it is a net negative standpoint there. But what is important to note is the source of the biomass here. So there are two distinct lines of BECCS. There's one which is the more common form, which is where you grow purpose-grown feedstocks. This is the traditional form of BECCS, I should say. You grow purpose-grown feedstocks like energy crops in order to process these, pellet them, and then use them in a power plant to generate electricity and heat. And then what you do is you actually retrofit a carbon capture unit on there in order to be able to suck in this CO2 and then permanently store it, normally in the geosphere, so in the rock record, or you can also put it into products, of course. And this is probably the more traditional form of BECCS and the more scalable form of BECCS in the long term, because of the pure volume you can have. And to give an example here, Drax Power Station in the UK has some very, very ambitious and great plans that you can hear to scale its operations. So this was once a coal power plant, but it's actually converted all of these to biomass now. So now it's running completely on bioenergy, on pellets. And then eventually in the late second half of this decade, they will retrofit carbon capture and storage units onto this and store it in the North Sea, and actually become probably the largest net remover of CO2 from the UK, storing, they hope to have 8 million tons of carbon dioxide captured per year in 2030. So you can see that the scale of this one is huge. On the flip side, the other side is what is being known as biomass carbon removal and sequestration. It's just a new fancy name for BECCS, essentially. But what a lot of the companies who do this differ themselves by is you don't need purposely grown energy crops. So, of course, across the world, we have a lot of areas, let's say landfill sites, wastewater treatment facilities, sewage sludge incineration, where we burn these biogenic emission sources in order to generate electricity, almost as the last potential use of these rather than landfill. So of course we reuse and recycle as much as possible, but then a lot of cities have waste to energy facilities, and also all cities have wastewater treatment facilities. Well, if we retrofit carbon capture and storage units onto these facilities, then we can capture the biogenic emissions from these and then store them underground. And then this is a form of BECCS where it's net negative. So at the start of the life of whatever these products are, they have photosynthesized and stored the CO2 in the biogenic matter. So the net process is a removal of CO2 from the atmosphere, but you don't have to worry about the kind of issues about your supply chain tracking of a more conventional forms of BECCS. And this is what I mean about the kind of controversy that we sometimes see with BECCS. So what's really important in the conventional form where you have purposely grown energy crops is you need to make sure that you can track the full life cycle emissions of the energy crops that go into it, and then the amount that is captured versus the amount that's emitted in the carbon capture and storage unit. Now, this is not a simple process at all, but it's also more complicated by the fact that we need to look into land use change, and we need to try to account for the fact that we have land use change and then something called indirect land use change. And this is, of course, nobody is saying that we should be deforesting in order to grow energy crops, because of course that is completely counterintuitive to the mission here. But what happens if you use a certain area of land that's been arable land for years, but because of this, food crops are now being grown on land that was deforested? So somehow you need to try to account for these indirect land use changes as well, which is where some of the controversy comes from in more traditional forms of BECCS and the amount of land that would be needed. If we look at the storage options, then what I've basically painted here is geological storage. So where you pump the CO2 in either a liquid or a gaseous form into underground geological reservoirs where it's stored for thousands to millions of years. It basically turns into the rock record and goes into the rocks geological time cycles. But you can also put it into products. You can also use it to make net negative cements, let's say, and things like that, and other products that require carbon dioxide, essentially. Okay, if we look into the full long-term potential of this technology, the IPCC 5th assessment report, which, okay, it came out in 2014, but it's still what is used upon a lot today. It includes a bunch of scenarios that help us to limit global warming to 2 degrees by 1990 levels, which is the highest that we should be aiming for. The majority of these scenarios that have a 66% or better chance of success include the use of nets, and mainly actually BECCS and afforestation, in order to achieve the 200 to 400 gigatons of CO2 that is likely to be needed to be removed by 2100. Now, the sheer scale of this, to put it in perspective, if we put a conservative price on the cost of a ton of carbon dioxide for this, makes this larger than the oil and gas market is today. So, this isn't a small problem that we're looking to fix and looking to scale, but it's also a huge opportunity. So it's an opportunity to industry, but we need to start now and we need to start today. Like other engineered solutions, direct air capture, BECCS requires a lot less land overall than afforestation, but it's clear to all involved that there's not going to be one silver bullet in this. If we need to hit these levels of removals, and that's why we need to scale today, which is why it's so great to hear about the projects like DRAX and how much it's doing. But also on the other end, the more bikers end that I mentioned, there's a project that has been in the news this week actually called the Fortum Oslo Varm waste to energy facility in Oslo in Norway. And this one is looking to capture 400,000 tons of CO2 per year, half of which is from a biogenic origin, so that is a removal, and then store it in the Northern Lights storage facility off the coast of Norway. So this just shows that things are on their way, and they're on their way within the next 2 or 3 years. And we need to follow these up with more and more projects as we go along to be able to scale. Now, before I hand it over to a Q&A, if anyone does have any questions involved or is involved with a BECCS or a BICAS project, please reach out to me. Probably the easiest way is via LinkedIn, and then I can discuss further. You know, as South Pole, we're doing a few things to try and make this transition to the scale up that's required as smooth as possible. So first of all, we have the CCS Plus initiative, which is where we're working with many market players in the industry and standards bodies in order to write the real methodologies that will be the first ICROA approved, so let's say the creme de la creme methodologies in this space, to be certain of the kind of claims that we're making to the removals here. And also, you know, as part of my role, I'm actively speaking to multiple companies who are beginning to launch in this space to better assess their technology and help them to become certified, and then to find people to purchase their credits to really make a market out of this. So another question, which I'll touch upon because I know it will come up in the Q&A, is, well, how much do these credits go for? You know, right now, if you want the cheapest credits, you don't look for technical removal credits because you can get cheaper ones in the nature-based world. But people do want these because they know that in 5-10 years time, they will need tech removals credits to hit their targets and to scale. And these are going from anywhere, I would say, biogenic credits like this, BECCS credits. You can look at a price from $50 a ton all the way to, let's say, $350 a ton. So there's a huge range, and it really depends on the technology and how you can prove that this technology can scale over time, I think. And on that, I am ready for the Q&A, Rob.
Thanks, Adam. I think there was a question coming in, but I wanted to have you touch on the maybe a little bit on taking aside a second for the biogenics versus, you know, traditional BECCS. Broadly speaking, what's kind of the energy density on some of these projects? Because I think that's one of the criticisms that was heard yesterday, excuse me, was if we're displacing coal, it's something like it's massively more energy productive than the biomaterials that you're using in BECCS. So any discussion or thoughts on that you've seen in the markets or how it's playing out?
I don't know off the top of my head, but what I would say is you pelletize the biomaterial essentially into pellets that you can feed into retrofitted coal materials, which is exactly what Drax is doing. So they're still one of the largest producers of electricity in the UK. And there hasn't been a problem, from my understanding, for the energy density of it. I've been to their site, and their site is the same size as it was when it was a coal facility. In fact, there's a bunch of extra area there that they can reuse, because you don't need to have as much on the flue gas desulfurization and denitrification angle, because you don't need to take those out of it as much.
That's actually a great hidden point there, not thinking about or aware of on space saving and room for additional deployments. Question from Connor on how much does regenerative agriculture play in either traditional or some of the works in some of what you're working with here? I mean, he mentions biochar and hemp, but just broadly speaking, regenerative agriculture, you mentioned that's kind of the devil of the details for some of the traditional BECCS. So can you talk a little bit more about that and some protocols that might be in place?
Yeah, I've not seen a link between BECCS and regenerative agriculture yet. But I would say that as South Pole, we are very much involved in regenerative agriculture, and for biochar projects in particular, it has huge potential. And I think as one of the core beliefs of South Pole is to use this to help to alleviate some of the poverty concerns and some of the injustice between the North-South divide. Biochar and other regenerative agriculture possibilities has a huge part to play there. In fact, you know, you can produce biochar anywhere, and then you can use it. Let's say I was speaking to somebody earlier today where you have hundreds of thousands of tons of chemical fertilizer being used. If you can replace some of this with biochar in a fertilizer mix, then you have huge co-benefits along with the pure carbon sequestration as well for the locals in terms of the pollutants that go into producing some chemical fertilizer and then spreading it.
That's really helpful. One other, well, let me see what else has popped up. So another follow-up on, I guess, maybe organic ag or regenerative ag and conventional ag, any difference on yields that you're aware of? Have you seen in what you're dealing with, or not as much from your perspective as far as sourcing projects?
Yeah, I don't focus on regenerative ag in my role with South Pole, but we are working on it. And from what I've seen, it's almost been the inverse. There's been greater production over time when you do factor in regenerative agricultural practices into your supply chain. Bearing in mind, if we look at the conventional forms of agriculture, the way they're going and the way that they're depleting our soils, the longer term picture is probably more of a concern with the decreased yields that we would have if we were to continue with our current intensive ways of working compared to how we could change.
Yes, the U.S. model of industrial farming, not necessarily the greatest for soil health. Well understood. One last question, we got a few minutes left. Can you talk a little bit more, I think, on, because one of the things that's most interesting to me is really, you mentioned it's urban applications and kind of the biogen side, and really where you're seeing those applications in wastewater treatment and things like in cities, because I think that's one of the challenges if a city wants to be net zero or sustainable, right? Is how am I dealing with waste in a way that's energy or smart across the board, from both, you know, human public health and everything else. So anything that you've seen on that, or innovations where you think that might have some more scaling potential, or things that you've seen, or what's exciting you there?
Yeah, I think it's low hanging fruit in this market in the short term. The big projects, the BECCS for power generation projects, take a little longer to set up. But these more modular designs with, you know, tens to hundreds of thousands of tons being captured per year are great for multiple cities across the world, which are looking to become net negative or net neutral, sorry, as you were saying. And we've seen this popping up across Europe. I would say I haven't seen it so much in the US so far, but in, you know, like I mentioned, in Oslo, there's this one, but there's also plans in most, I would say, of the major city hubs in Europe to have, let's say, like a hub structure in order to have a carbon capture and storage network. And normally within these, you include some form of waste to energy facility in order to capture that. There's one in Switzerland that is part of a project that's setting up there, and there's others in multiple different states. In North America, I think there is huge potential in waste to energy facilities and wastewater treatment facilities, and I know that there are a couple of companies out there exploring this angle. And then the one caveat, of course, is the emissions aren't as easy to control because they're more variable. So if you're taking plastics, for instance, because these will be all included into it as well in the waste that you can potentially be burning, you can have small amounts of trace metals that you weren't expecting, or other things, and you need to be able to account for it to make sure they don't clog up your systems. It's possible, but it just takes a little bit more effort.
Got it. Thanks a lot. Adam, we're at time, so thank you so much for joining us today. And I think, you know, what you brought up on sourcing and scaling some of these projects kind of leans into our next speaker of Generate Capitals. So thanks again, Adam, for joining us. And
thanks a lot.